Hello and welcome to Cambridge Skeptics YouTube channel. Cambridge Skeptics are a not-for-profit community organisation who promote positive skepticism and critical thinking. And today we are going to be talking with Dr. Phil Chadwick about 5G misinformation. And I'll hand straight over to Phil.
Right, thank you very much. I'm Phil, as you can tell from the caption. My background is about 35 years ago. I wandered.
Thank God for that, because I couldn't do it. I know nothing.
I wandered into a PhD in interaction with electromagnetic fields with people entirely by accident, and kind of stayed in the field afterwards. I worked at National Radiological Protection Board, Department of Health, and other places. And one thing I found of great interest recently is all the 5G stuff that's going on. So these guys asked me to come along and talk about it, which I obviously agreed to do willingly because it's fun. And this is what I've got to say. Do I control this slide, or can you? No, I've got to do it.
I think you do it. Yes.
Yeah. You. So there we are. So I think the first thing to do is actually talk about what 5G is, because it took me quite a long time when I started looking at it to nail this down. And talking to other people, it's not entirely clear to most people quite what it is and what it isn't. So 5G, it's a new thing. Well, it kind of isn't. It's just a phone system that does data, a lot like 3G and 4G, but just a bit better. And unlike 3G and 4G, it's not a single frequency. It's more of an envelope of technologies, which together just do stuff a little bit faster than the way it's been done before. I suspect most people on this call are probably familiar with the old electromagnetic spectrum stuff. And yeah, that's my point. That works as well. Brilliant. You obviously understand that you've got visible light and you've got X-rays and all of that stuff. And below that, you've got radio. And then you've got 5G, which sits over quite a wide band of the radio spectrum, where we find mobile phones and we find microwaves. And it's kind of important to realize that actually when we talk about mobile phones, we are talking about microwave signals. So by microwave, it's just a name for the top end of the radio spectrum. It's everything above about 300 megahertz. So microwave, it's a microwave oven. TV is a microwave signal. Mobile phones are also a microwave signal. It's all the same stuff. And clearly, in terms of biological effects, if you have enough of it, you get hot. We'll come on to that later.
I was about to ask that stupid question.
Well, feel free. The other thing is, feel free to ask any questions. I mean, I'm happy to sort of talk and be interrupted. So if I say something that doesn't make sense, or you want me to amplify it, just ask the question, and I'll pile it. But I am going to talk a little bit about that on the next slide. I pulled this table together, which really summarizes where 5G is in the radio spectrum and compares it with stuff we've already got. And there are essentially, in the UK at least, there are three main bands for 5G. The bottom band of it is around 600 to 700 megahertz. And this is actually very similar to TV signals, which is not surprising because they nicked this from the TV spectrum when they produced digital television. One of the drivers for going to digital was freeing up spectrum to give you 5G coverage. There isn't very much of this around at the moment. It's designed mostly for rural areas. It's pretty slow because of the low frequency, but it's got very good coverage. So for rural areas that don't currently have phone, don't currently have internet, you're going to have this low band 5G stuff at around 6 or 7 megahertz, 6 or 700 megahertz, which unsurprisingly looks like TV and looks remarkably like the old 2G, which was around 800-900 megahertz, up to about 1800. So in terms of the low band, it's pretty much identical to 2G and to 3G, 3G. Moving up a little bit, we've got the main mid-band of 3G, which is 3 to 3.8 gigahertz. And this is what nearly all of the 3G that's currently being rolled out in the UK is. So when people say, oh, there's a 5G mast at the end of my road, it's almost invariably this stuff. It looks remarkably like 3G and 4G because that's about 2.1 gigahertz. and it's very nicely saddled by the Wi-Fi bands of 2.4 and 5. So this stuff looks pretty much exactly like 3G, 4G, and pretty much exactly like Wi-Fi. So in terms of what we expect it to do to people, again, it's really nothing new. The only real differences between this and 3G, 4G are that it has better signal processing, it has some better codecs, and it's a little bit faster, but not spectacularly. So if you go and buy a 5G phone, it'll probably operate on this mid-band, and you might get slightly faster coverage, but it's not going to be radically different. And as I say, most of what we're talking about with 3G is this sort of mid-band stuff, which is genuinely spectacularly and exciting because it does look remarkably like the stuff we've already got.
So
And
you
then
said
you-
it had a, sorry, you said it had a better codecs. What's a
Oh, sorry, yeah, codecs is just the coding and decoding. So basically, they just throw more computing power at this. So
Okay.
your handheld device, where's my camera gone? Handheld device and the base station just have a lot more computer in them these days. So they can use better coding, they can use fancier stuff to make it go a little bit faster than you could back in the day of 3G, which was.
So that's the reason we need new devices and new antenna rather than anything.
I mean,
the signal itself.
you actually don't need, to be honest with you, 5G. It's going to give you marginally quicker. So it's not spectacularly faster than 4G. It's a bit more stable and it's a little bit faster. Where it's got a big benefit is it's got a much lower latency. So if you're a gamer, then you will find with this mid-band 5G, you will actually have a much better gaming experience. And it's probably a little bit snappier at delivering video and stuff, but it's not a game changer. And bear in mind, this is most of 5G. The stuff that is a game changer potentially is the high band, which is 24 to 28 gigahertz. So this is nearly a factor of 10. It is a factor of 10 higher in frequency than the existing 3G stuff. So it's a lot snappier as a result. But because it's at 28 gigahertz, it's essentially millimeter wave, and it's essentially line of sight. So it's really rubbish. If you have it on your phone, then as soon as you put your phone in your pocket, it stops working. So you are never actually going to see people walking down the street using the high band 5G. It's generally going to be used for static data links. If you go into a cafe and you use your laptop, then a 28 gigahertz signal in the laptop, in the coffee shop, is going to give you a fast download into your computer. And here you are going to see really very fast download speeds. But it requires a lot of very small cells, very localized, and you need line of sight on this. So this isn't the stuff that's going into the end of people's streets on poles. This is the small, very small microcells that are going to be in buildings to deliver essentially line of sight internet to essentially a fixed point. But in terms of what does it look like stuff we've already got, it's remarkably similar to existing satellite broadband and satellite TV and to line of sight data links. So even with this stuff, which is the kind of the new thing in 5G telecommunications, it still looks remarkably like a whole raft of other stuff that we've already got. So in terms of human exposure to 5G, is it any different than what we've already got? And the simple answer is no, it's not, because the low band looks like TV, the mid band looks like 3G, and the top band looks like a bunch of satellite TV stuff that we already have. So when people talk about 5G as being a new human exposure modality, it really isn't. It's some new technologies, but in terms of our own personal exposure to it, it's actually nothing new. It just looks like the stuff we've already got.
Been there, done that.
So I think this is important to realise when people worry about 5G, actually nothing new. Let's move down a bit on this. The other thing that we hear an awful lot about is the fact that 5G, because it has its very short signal distance, there's going to be lots and lots of little cells. This is going to massively increase the amount of human exposure to 5G over and above 3G. And this is fundamentally wrong. 2 and 3G did have an architecture of a lot of large, discrete towers. If you remember the early 2 and 3G stuff, these big metal latticework things dotted around the landscape, which were quite high power. Well, high power, 100 watts or so. 4G shifted that over to a more distributed small cell architecture. And that's not to do with anything to do with signal propagation. It's simply that this distributed array of smaller cells just gives you a lot more data processing. You've got a lot more channels available because you've got more base stations packed into the same sort of area. So in terms of channels, in terms of voice calls, in terms of data, this small cell architecture that 4G already uses and 5G will use actually just gives you an awful lot more call traffic in urban areas. This low band 5G that I spoke about earlier, the 600 or 700 megahertz stuff, that is actually still going to use the distributed one big cell architecture. The mid-band will use this small cell distributed architecture, and obviously the high band 28 gigahertz, that's going to have to use this small cell architecture because the propagation distances are so very much lower. So are they right when they say actually lots and lots of small cells, high human exposure? And the answer is no. It's exactly the opposite. The analogy I use is that you've got essentially the difference between one damn big mountain with this and a landscape of 1,000 molehills. You know, the actual signal strength that you need to talk to your device at the edge of the cell is the same, no matter what the architecture is.
1,000 molehills sounds like my back garden.
And mine, I've got hundreds of the damn things. But you actually need a certain signal strength. So at the edge of the cell boundary, to get that signal strength, because of the inverse square law, you need an absolutely massive power at the center of the cell. If a cell radius of 10 kilometers, inverse square, if your cell radius is only 100 meters, then your cell size is 100 less. And because of inverse square, you need 10 to the 4 times less power to get the same signal strength at the edge of the cell. So this architecture actually gives you generally much lower levels of human exposure. So there's more of it around. It's on every building, it's on every street corner. But these things are generally a watt or two, as opposed to 10 to 100 watts or so for this fella. So 5G actually is likely to give us eventually lower levels of exposure to RF rather than higher. And this is an important point. I think people talk about 5G as being this new, very high level of exposure because it's ubiquitous. But actually, because it's ubiquitous, the levels of exposure are going to be lower. Now, there's a case that while you're in transition and you've got 3G, 4G, and 5G, you may get a little bit of an increase while you've got everything going on. But once you fully transition and you get rid of the old stuff, then actually it is going to end up being lower.
Vince in the chat has got a question. Yep, there we go. So will we be seeing the big power masts disappearing over time, do you think?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, you are already seeing 2G being taken out. And in fact, the 2G networks are being sold to developing countries. 3G will also disappear because they want the bandwidth. You know, the 2 and 3G bandwidth is being folded over and it will be used for 5G in the future. Plus, why would you keep them? Because once everybody's got a 5G phone, that's the service that you then cover. The only argument then is that actually 3G and 2G are useful for the Internet of Things and things like smart meters. A lot of the existing IoT technology relies on 3G. So as 3G disappears, you are going to need to see some technological changes to see that replacement. But yes, you will see the old 2 and 3G going, just as we saw the old analog phone system disappear around the 2000s. And then 2 and 3G will also go. And then in time, as 6G and 7G come in, 5G itself will also disappear. But I think it's important to recognise that what you'll actually see probably is a gradual change. So your 4G towers, 4G masts will evolve into 5G, and then one day your phone will stop saying 4G and it'll say 5G. But you won't see the mast being demolished and a new mast going up. It'll just be that whatever's driving the antenna has been changed over to a new 5G system. As 4G essentially is being upgraded all the time, and it's being upgraded to the point where one day what is 4G will actually become 5G, and then one day that will eventually become, in its own time, 6G. It's more of an evolution for a lot of this stuff, certainly in the mid-band, than it is revolution. Yeah. So let's do some, before we get on to the really wacky stuff in terms of the misinformation and the really interesting kind of crazy stuff that people believe. Health effects. I already mentioned that it's microwave, and like any microwave, if you get overexposed to it, then you can get heated up, and that's the primary basis of the exposure limits. That's not any cause for concern for the general public. If you shimmy up a high power radio transmitter, then yeah, you can get into areas where the RF exposure is sufficiently high that you can get heating with people. And for that reason, for occupational environments, there are strict controls. Now, if you go and dangle in front of a 100 megawatt EIRP TV tower, you are going to get into some serious trouble because you are going to get overheated. So the guys who climb towers have very strict protocols in place. They're climbing up through high power masts and stuff. That's all very strictly controlled. But again, because of the inverse square law, by the time you get down to ground level, actually there isn't anywhere where you can get within 1,000th of these thermal safety limits for general public exposure. And mobile phone stuff is really quite low power. So even the old 2 and 3G stuff is only 10 to 40 watt. So you've actually got to get right in close to it to get into any sort of place where you've got to worry about the exposure compared to limits. And 5G, as I said, because of this small cell architecture, is generally lower power again. So in terms of the actual known thermal effects of exposure, you can forget it. So we're talking about really very, very low levels of exposure, much, much lower than anything that's going to cause any thermal consequences whatsoever.
Phil, you've referenced the inverse square law a couple of times. Yeah. I think that's where, as you say, halve a distance, you get one square, the square of a half in terms of the radiation. So if it's a tenth of the distance, you get 1/100th of the radiation. If it's a sat thousandth of the distance.
That's exactly right. Thanks for that. I tend to sort of forget to say that sort of stuff, and that's actually a very important point. So if your mast is 50 meters up in the air, then you're proportionally much further away from the thing than if you were dangling right in front of it.
Yeah. So if you're a meter away versus 50 meters away is 2,500 times the radiation.
Right. Yeah, and the sorts of compliance distances that you're talking about for these things are probably centimeters to tens of centimeters for 5G. A little bit higher for 3G. It's about a meter probably in front of it. So as you say, you're sort of thousands of times below. And if you go out there with a meter and you wave it around in front of masts, whatever the activists may tell you, you won't measure anything higher than 1%, tenth of 1% of any safety level. And these are threshold levels, so as long as you're underneath them, there's no problem. And you're so far underneath them that the sorts of thermal burdens that you're seeing are completely inconsequential compared to your central heating or going out in sunshine or any of these other thermal environments that we meet. So we're really not talking about thermal effects, we're talking about other stuff. And one of the things that people throw around is, well, it's not tested because it's new. And there's two strands to that. There's first of all, is it actually tested? Well, yeah, the answer is clearly yes, it is, because every radio device that's put on the market has to meet safety limits, so they are all tested. They all go through labs and they all have the emissions tested and they're all shown to be compliant with limits. So in terms of tested, in that respect, yeah, they're all tested. But that's not what really people mean. I mean, people mean by tested, do we know that it's safe? And that's a kind of a different question. And the answer to that is yes, we do. For any definition of safe that science will ever give you, show me a definition that fresh air is safe. All you can do is say, well, we've looked at all the studies and the risk appears to be indistinguishable from zero. And that does seem to be the case. It's a very researched topic. Over the last 3 decades, I think we've spent collectively $12 billion on mobile phone health research. And there's a database of something in excess of 25,000 existing studies on it. And that in itself throws up some interesting problems, because I mean, you guys probably know, maybe some of the audience do, that there's a significant false positive rate in biomedical research, right? So any study, there's about between a quarter and a third chance that it's probably just wrong. And by wrong, I mean that it's either proves that you can't replicate it, or it's seriously flawed, or it's just basically a bit rubbish. And we know with biomedical research that a good third of it is junk. And it's the same in this field, and in fact it's arguably worse, because it's actually quite difficult to do good mobile phone studies because the technology is quite difficult. So of this 25,000 studies, probably between a quarter and a third of them are expected to be junk. And actually we see somewhere between about a quarter and a third of these showing positive results. And that's entirely consistent with what we expect if there's nothing going on. And what you do see, which is interesting, is that the better done studies don't find anything, and the really bad ones are the ones that actually tend to find something. So around about 20 years ago, maybe a little bit longer now, there were some very big national research programs. There was one in the UK and there was some in the US, where really high quality work was done. And it was done in order to answer the question, we're giving everybody in the world essentially a low power microwave device to hold against their head. Do we actually know for sure that there's no problem with that? 20 years ago, there were some unanswered questions. So there were some big high power programs. The results of those came out subsequently. And because they were big national programs audited by people like the National Physical Laboratory, they came back with the answer saying, actually, do you know what? We can't find anything. So what you find is the really good studies don't find anything, but there's a raft of low quality studies that perhaps do find something. And this is why it's possible, if you cherry pick out of this data set, I can find you 4,000 studies that say that mobile phones will cause cancer or Alzheimer's or whatever it is. I can find you 20,000 more that don't say that. But it's still possible to construct a case if you just cherry pick the really bad ones.
Which someone's going to do with what you just said. They're going to clip that little bit.
so you kind of get into these debates where you say, well, there's this paper from like 1998 where somebody exposed beehives to, they put a mobile phone on top of them, all the bees died. And you go, yeah, but it's really rubbish. And here's one from like 2015 where somebody did that properly and they didn't find anything. So there's an almost infinite supply of papers that people can throw at you saying there's a problem. But there's a bigger infinity, if you like, of papers that you can throw back saying that there isn't.
But this is highlighting the importance of not looking at any single study, but rather reviewing and keying into the scientific consensus. The people in the know, the people able to review whether these are garbage studies or valid studies, are able to sort of filter this out and take the total view, like yourself.
That's bang on. And in fact, my next bullet point there says independent expert reviews, and this is the fact that there are over 80 now properly independent expert reviews by panels of people all over the planet, multidisciplinary independent experts who've sat down and done this. And pretty unequivocally, they find actually that there's nothing going on. There are one or two people who have found something, and when you look at the people who are involved in that, you go, actually, I'm not surprised. But the sort of genuinely independent groups have generally not found anything.
Related to that, we have another good question in the chat about safety compliance. So basically, we used to be in the CE marking. Do you know if there's been any replacements requirements since post-Brexit?
That's a good question from Azadeh. As far as I know, and you probably know this better than I do, Azadeh, because you're more into the sort of government links. As far as I know, the UK is transiently sticking to the existing stuff. And I know in terms of towers and masts, they have said that the UK will stick with the IGNIRP, which is the international limits for now. And as far as I'm aware, the UK is still respecting CE marking on stuff. But this is one of those areas post-Brexit which people haven't really thought about. It's not one that's high up on the agenda of government, as you can imagine, because there's actually stuff out there which can actually harm people, which they're prioritising getting protection on. And this stuff, which probably doesn't harm anybody, has kind of slipped between the cracks. So as far as I know, yes, it's still covered, but I would be very surprised if there's any activity to make sure that the previous CE marking regime is adhered to. And it's important to say that there is actually practically very little to zero post-market compliance of any of this in the UK, because there isn't the resource. You know, environmental health officers don't have the expertise, and government doesn't have the resource to do it either. So a lot of this is dependent on studies and testing that's done elsewhere. So when somebody like Samsung has their device tested in their lab in Korea, there will be a compliance, and you can look at that. And that's what you have to trust, really, I think, rather than expecting the UK to be independently able to generate its own set of test criteria, which, you know, realistically, I don't think.
So we're not getting a British crown mark on our phones anytime soon?
Possibly we will, but I would be astonished if it was anything different than just a rebadging of the European standard that was written some years ago, because there isn't the resource. You know, the number of people who can do that in the UK, you can probably count on the fingers of one hand. The resource lies elsewhere, so we are not going to be able to sit down and write a complete comprehensive set of EMS standards for the UK from scratch. We just take down off the shelf the ones that we've already done for the European Union and just cross out EU and put UK on the front of it. That's my expectation. And that's probably sensible, to be fair, on that. Just moving on quickly with one eye on the time, on my next, after independent expert reviews, I've got plausible mechanisms for harm. And you know, one of the most important things about all of this is, okay, you say it's harmful. Why? We know that, you know, ionizing radiation causes cancer because it damages DNA, it knocks electrons out of water, you get stuff smashing about inside cells, and you get damage. And we also know that there's a break point for ionizing radiation, which is in the ultraviolet. So we know you get sunburn causes cancer. There's a break point at about 11 electron volts, which is another way of talking about energies, whereby everything above that is ionizing, it can cause cancer. Everything below that is what we call non-ionizing. It can't directly damage DNA. So you've got to look for some other mechanism as to why you would expect a radio to be able to give you cancer, right? And there isn't really one. There is no, to my mind, there's no plausible explanation for why a radio itself could ever cause cancer. There's not enough energy in the signal to directly damage DNA. The way the cell membrane reacts with radio fields is very weak for some technical reasons. And it's fair to say there is actually no plausible reason to expect why a radio would ever kill you. So that, I think, is a reasonable starting point. So the fact there's no plausible mechanism to expect harm, and you've got this database of 25,000 studies which collectively say, actually, the risk seems to be indistinguishable from there being no harm, is pretty powerful. And the other strand in that is the evidence of risk at population level. So you might say, well, okay, when mobile phones were introduced in the mid-80s, a few people had them. They became pretty prevalent in the 90s. I think I got my first one at the end of the 90s. Now everybody's got one. So you might expect, if there was a risk, to see some step change in cancer risk or brain cancer risk or something else with a temporal correlation, either instantaneous or within 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, of the introduction of common usage of mobile phones. And you just don't see that. We are seeing a general increase in cancer rising up because people are living longer generally, so there's more of us dying of cancer. And there is a gradual increase in brain cancer again because people are living longer and dying less of other things. But you are not seeing any sort of step change in cancers of the regions exposed when you use a mobile phone. And you're not seeing any step change really in any other cancers either. So if there is a risk at population level, again, it's got to be really small because we're just not seeing it. So you've got a population level observed risk, which is indistinguishable from zero, apparently. You've got no plausible mechanism for harm. and you've got this massive database of stuff which is telling us there's probably no risk. So on those bases, you think, well, actually, probably, why should I be scared of this? And this is a question I often ask people. You're telling me I should be worried about 5G. Well, you've already said it looks remarkably like 2G, 3G satellite phones. And we know for all of that stuff that there doesn't appear to be a risk. So why am I scared of it? And I've never had a convincing answer for that. And then on the other side of my little chart, people say, yeah, but uncertainty. We're not sure. No, we're not. You can never be certain. But we've got a pretty good idea of this. It's about the most researched physical agent after ionizing radiation. And yeah, people claim other effects at lower levels, but yeah, people always will. Are some people more sensitive? Again, the evidence is that, you know what, they probably aren't. There's a good set of studies done 10, 20 years ago where volunteers were exposed to mobile signals, people who claimed they were hypersensitive, people who self-identified as electromagnetic hypersensitives. And there's a good raft of studies with those people, and it shows that actually they can't tell the damn difference when you turn the signal on than when you do a sham. So very carefully controlled double-blind trials with people who claim to be hypersensitive to RF. And under controlled laboratory conditions, they demonstrably aren't. So if you look at the WHO definition of hypersensitivity to electromagnetic fields, it says, well, okay, it's a real syndrome, but it's nothing to do with electromagnetic fields. It's a belief, or it's caused by something else. So these people exist, they have symptoms, there's no question about that. They are suffering, but it's not to do with phones. The problem with that lies elsewhere. And WHO are really quite clear on that. And then the other good one, well, couldn't the science change? You guys are very positive, but there's still work going on. Couldn't we know in 10 years' time, perhaps everybody could be dying in the streets? Well, okay. But we already have 25,000 studies in this database. And there isn't actually very much more work being done. The big peak in mobile phone health studies was late 90s, early 2000s. There was millions of pounds of research money swirling about. Everybody and their dog was doing mobile phone research. And it was possible to make a very nice career out of it, and many of us did. And I freely admit to that. These days, that tap has been shut off because there doesn't appear to be a big problem. And in 1998, I could go to the Minister for Health and I could say, do you know what, Minister, we actually don't know that giving everybody a mobile phone isn't going to be the next BSE. And they go, oh yeah, great, do you want some money? Fantastic, give me a research program. And we were able to spend millions on research. These days, you can say, actually, it's not the next BSE because we know that people are not dying in streets. If it's a problem, it's a very, very small problem. And the minister says, well, actually, I've got other problems. I've got alcoholism, and I've got social exclusion, and I've got smoking, and I've got obesity, and I've got a raft of real-world problems that we're going to spend the money on. It's not going to you guys. And that's the case pretty much everywhere in the world. So there is some research going on, but there is very little. So it's vanishingly unlikely that the number of studies will ever stack up to oppose the 25,000 we've got. You essentially have to have the same number of studies again, all saying the opposite. And the chances of that are essentially zero. So could the science change? Probably not. Not unless something absolutely radical shows up.
So what research is still going on?
Very, very little. I mean, there's a few bits and bobs of stuff. There's a few bits of epidemiology kicking around. But there's no big national research programs around. There's a few universities. And in fact, one of the problems now is what is being done is generally bits of stuff with sort of random funding. And a lot of it is groups who are not that expert. So 20 years ago, you had a lot of the big names in epidemiology, real world-class people were involved in some of these cancer studies. And there was money available there. People took like 20 million to look at some of this stuff. Big, well-done studies at Oxford and Cambridge and elsewhere. High-quality research. These days, the studies are being done by people who are perhaps not the world's best leading epidemiologists, because those guys are now off looking at other stuff. And the funding is coming from universities and research foundations. There's very little quality control. So you do still see stuff. I do peer review, obviously for journals, and I still get papers coming through, and some of them are frighteningly bad. And some of them still get published because obviously there's only one referee who might say, actually, this is frighteningly bad. And the other three guys have said, it looks all right to me. And then it comes out. So there is still stuff trickling through. And unfortunately, the stuff trickling through tends to be lower quality than it was 20 years ago because it's just not being funded by people who are, they're not the National Physical Laboratory and they're not keeping a beady eye on the quality of it. So
on that subject, we've got a question from Michelle in the chat about a paper that may have shown.
One of my favourites, the NTP. This is a great example. A great example of a terrible study. This was done by the National Toxicology Program in the US, and it cost them, I think, $26 million to do this study. Should have been fantastic, but it really wasn't. So they exposed rats and mice to mobile phone signals. But there's a raft of problems. I mean, some of the reviews of this are pretty scathing. I mean, I'm not qualified to go into the histology, but the histology reviews are pretty damning of it. My background is in dosimetry, so it's in what people are exposed to. My fundamental problem with this is that the exposure levels they use for the animals were something like 78 to 80 times above the exposure limits, right? So they're exposing animals at significantly thermal levels of exposure. They actually saw, they were having to put thermometers in the animals to check that they weren't overheating. They were getting core temperature rises in the animals that they were testing. So to me, what that's telling you is what you're looking at here is heat. To me, Science 101 is if you're going to look at RF, expose the animal to RF, don't expose it to heat and RF. Because we know heat has a raft of biophysical and biochemical effects. It's a known teratogen at high enough levels, and it certainly causes a whole load of changes, which we don't think RF does. So it certainly seems to be the case in this study that they're essentially cooking the animals. They found some cancers in some of the rats, but only the male rats, not the females, and they didn't find anything in the mice. It was, I think, an absolutely appalling waste of animals. If you're going to do this study, you could have done it really well. And if you're going to use animals, to me, you should use them correctly. Ethically, you shouldn't be using animals for a bad study. And it was a waste of money, and it soaked up a bunch of research money for something that could have been done well. I mean, it was so bad that they couldn't actually get it published in a peer-reviewed journal. They had to publish it themselves in the end because they tried a number of times to get it peer-reviewed, and it just crashed.
Have they essentially sort of made themselves the Andrew Wakefield of?
Well, it's not quite that bad. I mean, they are bona fide, reputationally correct scientists. So the guys doing the work were good scientists and knew what they were doing. They were, I think, badly advised on the RF levels. And I think they probably should have had somebody on board who was able to tell them actually there were a raft of problems with this early on. So it's a bunch of competent scientists, I think, going probably in the wrong field, going into an area where somebody. The thing is that they are toxicologists. So having tried to discuss this with them, they say, well, it's toxicology. So in toxicology, what we do is we hit the animal with a big dose and try and get a response, and then we try and scale it down. And that's the toxicological approach. If we're going to see a response, we see it at a high level, and then if we see a high level, well, that's great, but it's like trying to test, some liquid on an animal, and you throw it at the animal still in the bottle, and it's the bottle that's causing the effects, which is what you're seeing here with the heating. So to me, somebody should have said to them, well, okay, I understand that. You want to have a higher level than human exposure to mobile phones. So go to a higher level than mobile phones, but still one that's actually not at a level where you're seeing thermal effects in the animals. But as you can tell, I could talk about that study all day. I need to get on. We've only got about 20 minutes left, I think, so I need to get on to
the crazy stuff.
The crazy stuff. Let's do the crazy stuff, guys.
Yeah.
Let's move on. Yeah, conspiracy theory stuff. I spend a lot of my time having fun trying to argue with these people, and I've kind of acquired a series of wacky stuff that I've picked up in the last 2 years, and this is some of it. So I thought I'd try and tackle some of these. The one you get a lot is 5G a weapon, or is it military technology? And there's a conviction that 5G is military. And of course, it's complete nonsense. The argument seems to be that, yes, there are some military microwave weapons, and in particular, there are some millimeter wave weapons. There's a US military area denial system, which works at similar frequencies to this top end of 5G, these 20 to 30 gigahertz frequencies. And the American military have this thing on the back of a truck, and it's a massively powerful dish, which essentially beams very high power millimeter waves at crowds, and it's to disperse crowds. And the reason is, if you get hit with a beam of very intense millimeter waves, you get a very rapid surface heating of the skin, and it hits the pain sensors. And it's really a very unpleasant sensation, and it's great for scattering crowds. But of course, it's relying on the fact that it's a damn big power. You know, the thing's on the back of a truck, it's got an antenna which is focusing it right down, and you're on the receiving end of a really pokey millimeter wave signal. So it's essentially, it's like sticking your hand into some hot water. You go, Jesus, that hurts, and you back away. So that's not millimeter waves being a weapon, it's intense millimeter waves being intensely painful. And if you scale that power down by a factor of like 10,000, they stop being painful and they just become millimeter waves. So that's where this argument that it's a weapon or military technology comes from. It's this misbelief, and this is a very common, people believe that all of 5G is millimeter wave. And in fact, as we've seen, most of it isn't. Most of it looks like 3G. Only this top end looks a bit like millimeter wave, of which there's very little, and only in cities. And even that is vanishingly low power, and it looks more like your Sky TV than it does the US military aerial denial system. But that, I think, is where it comes from, as far as I can tell. So that is, as we in the industry say, complete bobbins. The other one, this is a great one. Has the insurance industry refused to cover anyone against disease or injury used by phone technologies? And this is used an awful lot. It's, yeah, but Lloyds of London have said that they will no longer insure mobile phone companies against cancers caused by mobile phones. And I spent ages tracking this down to the actual Lloyds of London statement, and there's a kind of a kernel of truth in this. What it actually says is that Lloyds of London will not give you insurance money to sue a mobile phone company because you think you've got brain cancer, because Lloyds of London don't think this is a very good use of their money. So in the same way that they won't insure you against being kidnapped and probed by space aliens, they won't insure you against being given cancer by a mobile phone. And it's not that they think there's a risk, it's that they just don't want to have their money spent, you know, doing the ambulance chasing through the courts. Because if you look at the legalistic history of this, it's been taken to court in a number of countries. It was in court in the UK in 2005, and I know because I was that expert witness, when somebody tried to sue Hutchison 3G and lost pretty catastrophically. It's been tried in the US with a rather more litigious system, and no court case has ever really got to the stage of being heard. They've all stalled at the point at which evidence has been called. The only one that's ever succeeded, there was a case in Italy a couple of years ago where somebody did actually manage to get an Italian court to give them compensation for getting brain cancer from a mobile phone. But it's Italy. You know, this being the same country where they jailed a bunch of volcanologists for not being able to predict eruption. So that's more the case of Italy than anything else. But that, as far as I'm aware, is the only legal case on the planet that has ever actually succeeded, and it's not any sort of precedent.
And I was just say I work in an insurance company on the pricing and underwriting side, and ultimately, if you're going to provide a product, you have to be very specific over what it covers and what it doesn't cover. And also, you're not allowed to provide products that people can't claim against. So if you
Right.
don't think that someone can get cancer because of 5G, you can't then give them insurance to cover them in case they get cancer over 5G. It's literally just like the FCA would come down, you look at a ton of bricks.
I mean, it's complete nonsense, because if you could prove that you'd been injured, you could actually sue the company directly. You don't need to have insurance for it. You would actually take them to court and say, you know what, my other half has died, I got a brain tumour because of your phone. I want £20 million compensation, please. And that's what these court cases are about. You know, you wouldn't go and claim off your insurance company. How would you do that? I don't even know where you begin. So it basically, this is another nonsense. I know a great one. Is it killing birds and bees? Well, the birds one is fascinating, because you do see these instances where it's a bit like these TV programs where suddenly birds fall out of the sky. You guys probably know about this more than I do. But there are YouTube videos of birds falling out of the sky. It was in 2012, that movie, wasn't it, where it all started when the birds fell out of the sky.
I think the main thing is that their batteries ran out.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Because we all know that birds aren't real. I know. That's exactly right. So yeah, there are instances of birds, for whatever reason, birds having mass dyings. It happens, and we don't probably fully understand why. But there was a case in the Netherlands where somebody had claimed this had happened around a 5G mast, and it went viral. And it turns out, one, it wasn't a 5G mast, it was 3G, and two, it wasn't even turned on. Right? So this is debunked. You can go and find the link for yourself. But the sort of wellspring of the claim that birds are being killed by 5G is this YouTube video, which is fantastically debunked by the Netherlands radio agency, who just said, well, yeah, but it wasn't even turned on, and it's not 5G. So that's a complete end to that story. It's complete nonsense. And the bees is similar. You know, bees are dying. You know, hive dieback. Oh, yeah, they are. And it's varroa parasites, and it's lack of habitat, and it's climate change, and it's all that other stuff. And then there's some terrible studies where people have put a mobile phone on top of a beehive and said, look, all the bees have done. And you think, well, but that mobile phone is not exposing anybody to anything. It's just a mobile phone. You know? And when you do the proper studies with the bees and you do control it, it all just disappears. Plus, and the really good one is, of course, insects have very little interaction cross-section because of the wavelength. You know, the wavelength of most of 5G is at centimeters. Think about it, you know, it's sort of 10, 12 centimeter radiation. Your average insect is a centimeter or two, and it's vastly smaller than a quarter wavelength, so you actually don't have any interaction anyway. You see this, you often see videos of flies inside microwave ovens, and the flies emerge unhurt because they've got almost no interaction cross-section with the wavelength of the 2.45 gigahertz signal in the microwave oven. So again, it's implausible, unless they're dragonflies, I suppose, with a big wingspan. Then it might be. But I haven't seen anything specific to sort of big insects, moths, dragonflies. It's always bees, and bees are pretty small. So again, and then this is a great one. Does 5G suck all the oxygen out of your body? And genuinely, I had this thrown at me at the time of COVID. It's not COVID. It's a 5G transmitter sucking the oxygen out of your lungs. And this is because if you look at the absorption, the microwave absorption spectrum of air, there's a very nice absorption peak. There's a water absorption peak at about 22 gigahertz. And there's an oxygen absorption at about 60 gigahertz, right? And this is one of the reasons why they have a lot of trouble with line of sight millimeter wave, because the air is actually comparatively opaque, and it's certainly coloured, most frequencies. It's got quite a lot of absorption. So the argument goes, well, there's an oxygen absorption at 70 gigahertz. This is millimeter wave. 5G is millimeter wave, even though it isn't. Therefore, 5G is interacting with the oxygen in the air. Therefore, 5G is sucking the oxygen out of your lungs. My argument to this is, well, you know, red blood cells are red because they're oxygenated. Does that mean that red light then sucks the oxygenated blood out of your body? It's the same argument. Clearly, it's complete nonsense. But this is what was being thrown around 2 years ago at the time of COVID. It was the explanation for why you were seeing COVID from 5G masts. And it's nonsense for all those reasons. And primarily because, as we've said, most of 5G is actually around about 3.5 gigahertz, where there is absolutely no resonance of oxygen or water or anything else. Graphene oxide, this is a fantastic one, stuff in vaccines. Well, I had to Google, when I first saw this, I had to Google graphene oxide because I thought, well, graphene's carbon, therefore graphene oxide is carbon dioxide. But of course, you guys probably know this, it isn't. And graphene oxide is a graphene matrix with various organic compounds that have been attached onto it. So it's a biochemically active graphene matrix with carboxyl groups and stuff attached onto it. And there is some quite interesting biological stuff going on, and it has been mooted as a possible adjuvant in vaccines. But as far as I'm aware, it's not been used yet. Even if it is, how would it interact with 5G? You know, is this graphene somehow a radio antenna? Even though it's completely the wrong size. To be a radio antenna, you've got to be a significant fraction of the wavelength, which, as we've said, is already like 10, 12 centimeters, and graphene really isn't. It's inside your body, right? So the penetration depth of radio waves, even at 3 gigahertz, is only millimeters to centimeters. So this stuff is inside you. So your body's shielding it, and it's not a radio transmitter, but it's still somehow interacting with the 5G to send a signal back to Bill Gates or Zuckerberg, wherever it is, even though it's not a radio and it's not an antenna and it's inside you. And the same goes for aluminium nanoparticles. They're in vaccines, and the aluminium is excited by the 5G. Well, it's the same argument. There isn't aluminium in vaccines. There's aluminium. There used to be aluminium compounds, so you guys probably know, like there used to be mercury compounds in some vaccines. There isn't so much anymore, but it's not metallic aluminium. Why would it be? Because metallic aluminium would react quite spectacularly in an aqueous environment. Finding powdered aluminium, very reactive. You don't want that in your body. Again, tiny amounts, and it's in your body. It's just complete nonsense. But people still believe that vaccines somehow are beaming their personality back to Bill Gates by the aluminium that's in their vaccine.
Which they're definitely not doing on their phones anyway.
Well, that's right.
That was what always got me, is like, hang on. Like, okay, you think you're being microchipped, but no, right, we can go over this ground again. But
you've got a phone. Right? The other great one, this is one that came out, it wasn't your guys' site, but it was a different Facebook site, a different Skeptics site. 5G is why they banned lead paint. Because lead paint is conductive, right? Come back to that in a minute. And therefore, people's houses painted with lead paint could stop them beaming 5G into your house and stealing your thoughts. And
nobody wants my thoughts.
Well, quite. Nobody wants your thoughts. And hang on a minute. Lead paint is not conductive because, again, it's not metallic lead. Okay, you can buy conductive paint to shield against RF, and they use it in various industries. It's silver loaded, and it's quite a good RF shield, but it's full of metallic silver. Lead paint is not full of metallic lead for obvious reasons. It's full of lead oxide, which is a compound. It's a dielectric. It's not a conductor. So lead paint is non-conductive. So even if this wasn't complete bobbins, it would be complete bobbins because lead is not a conductor. So is that why they banned lead paint? No, they banned lead paint because it kills you if you eat it. But you will see Facebook groups advocating the return of lead paint because it stops people killing you with 5G. And to me, this is the epitome of 21st century stupid. Until perhaps we get to Havana Syndrome, which might be the epitome of 21st century stupid. This is one which you've probably seen in the papers where the American embassy, it started in Moscow, and it's popped up subsequently, where the American embassy staff believed they were having microwaves beamed at them by baddies, and these microwaves were affecting their health. Okay, well, unfortunately, the American, I think it was CIA, convened a panel of people to look into this, and this panel of people consisted of people who knew nothing about RF, and they said, yeah, genuinely, RF has some health effects. So this could genuinely be the reason why these people were ill. And you think, well, really? Because to get an actual biological response...
Was it toxicologists again?
Well, I don't know who they were. Probably they certainly weren't RF engineers. But to actually get enough RF into a room to elicit a biological response, not only ill health, you would literally be setting the curtains on fire. The power densities in the room, there'd be arcing and sparking through the television set. Stuff will be smoking. The curtains will be smouldering. So you then back to the idea.
But it's possible. That's what you're saying.
Well, it's certainly possible. If you parked a massive truck outside with a huge antenna on the top of it, size of my house, and beamed microwaves into a room, which I think people might spot,
Yeah,
then
it's
the
not very
inside of the room would get extremely hot and stuff would start smoking, and then you might get a biological effect. If you then dial that down and say, well, okay, it's much, much, much lower levels, you then back into the syndrome of, well, if it's much, much, much lower levels, isn't this exactly the same as TV and radio and mobile phone signals? So what is it they're doing that's actually different than just an urban environment having a radio background? And my question was, has anybody actually measured the radio background in any of these sites where this Havana Syndrome is being claimed? And the answer is no. They didn't even bother to go and measure what the RF exposure levels were in the embassy in Cuba. And I see this week they're now saying that it's in lots of embassies all around the world. But to me, that just says it's not microwaves, it's something else. It's probably psychosocial, or it's whatever you want to call it, stress. Certainly being an embassy employee in many of these places is probably pretty stressful.
Didn't it came up in the news like in the last couple of weeks, I think?
Yeah, it did. Yeah, they found it in lots of other embassies. So it was originally just Havana, but it was Moscow originally, and then it was Havana, and then now they basically sent out this survey to all the American embassies house saying, do you get headaches? Do you often feel a bit stressed? Do you find that you're feeling a bit under the weather? Oh yeah, I do. Right. Okay. Well, it's Havana Syndrome. Gee, it's
I clearly have it.
Well, exactly. I don't, because I don't tend to get very stressed these days.
Yeah, but you live in an area with no 5G. So.
Well, that's true. No, you have found me out on that. You're right. But certainly when I used to have a fairly stressful job, 20 years ago, I had all this stuff. And it's clearly down to the stresses of everyday life. And that's what it is. And this is genuinely one of the problems. There is a spectrum of health out there, and a lot of people do feel pretty bad a lot of the time, certainly in urban environments, and it's remarkably easy to blame 5G. And there's people who are being made ill, people who have brain cancer. Unfortunately, people die of stuff. And again, I don't know what's causing this. I don't know what 5G is. Therefore, it's probably 5G. And that's where I shall leave you with a couple of minutes to go if there are any other questions, or any of you guys want to ask anything on me.
So yeah, has anybody got in the chat got any questions? Get them in now. Chris or Sam, do you have anything you want to ask?
So have you heard any 6G information yet?
6G, yeah, I've certainly been told that the Chinese are working on 6G. No, it's quite difficult, because what do you mean by 6G? Because 5G has a big book, a big standards definition. Now there is a standard, but it's probably 25,000 different standards which define what the 5G interface is, like there was for 3G. So we actually know what 5G is. 6G is just the next generation. So yeah, there are certainly guys in universities all over the planet working on what's the next iteration for mobile comms. It's going to be smart antennas, steerable stuff. There's going to be a raft of really clever technical solutions that are going to inform whatever the next generation is, and there are guys working on that. There are,
and there's also a generation of conspiracy theorists coming up with the next generation of conspiracy theories about 6G.
Right, exactly. So yeah, 6G conspiracy. So it's 7G, 8G. It's all out there. It just means that there is stuff in the pipeline. So 5G will be old hat. In 10 years' time, we're going to be worrying about 6G at 60 gigahertz or whatever it's going to be, or whatever the argument is.
So you'll be back then?
I hope not, no. I genuinely hope that A, I will completely retire, and B, people will just move on to something else. But they probably never will. But there are other people on this call, and I'm looking at Azade, who was on the call earlier, who is leading the good fight from within government on this. So there's a lot of people who've got their heads screwed on about this, who know what's going on. So I think the important thing is we are not ever going to see the people who set laws and set regulation actually jump and start setting stupid regulations. You know, people, let's come back to this a little point actually, people say, oh, but other countries have banned 5G. Well, that's not true. If you go and look at it, nobody's ever banned 5G. You will find some local city councils have produced edicts saying we don't want 5G, because city councils can be influenced by activists and they have councillors who are not technical experts. But no national government, who are of course informed by technical experts and understand that if you start having arbitrary political limits, you end up having no telecommunication system. They've not set limits. And there's a beautiful example of this in Brussels. Brussels is one of the places where they cited that Brussels has banned 5G. And Brussels indeed introduced quite a stringent set of limits based on nothing in particular, which limited public exposure to RF. And they then realised that actually if they did that, they couldn't have any 5G networks. So the city council were then lobbied by the mobile phone companies and said, well, that's great, guys. If you don't want any 5G in Brussels, if that's what you want. And they went, actually, do you know what? We could just raise these levels. We'd still be very protective of people, but if we just raise them enough that to allow this new technology to come in, we're still being precautionary and we're still being protective of people, because we've still got limits that are lower than the statutory limits, but they do also allow this new technology. And to me, that's just awful, because you're just essentially setting an arbitrary political limit on something which is set on convenience. You know, you're saying, actually, I'm going to keep moving my limit up to the point at which it's not actually impinging on any technology. And you think, well, if it's not impinging on technology, what's its point? So at least in this country, we're not doing that.
This feels like the whole, like, I always, I don't know, I'm struggling with an example now, but, I always eat bran flakes in the morning. I've never been killed by a tiger, therefore bran flakes prevent tigers. Like, it's not, it has no effect whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem is, of course, for a long time people didn't take it very seriously. So when I first started working in this field, I had a job I was seconded to the Department of Health working on policy. And ministers were getting inundated with their inboxes with people writing about mobile phone base stations. But the scientists in the place I was working in the other half of my job, which was a government agency, were saying, well, we're all ionising radiation guys and we don't actually think there's an issue with this, so we're not going to put any resource into it. And I was saying, well, no, okay, it might not be an issue, but we don't know that for sure. And the way to tackle this is actually to fund the research to show that it's not an issue. And that's how you kill unnecessary concern. And in the end, the UK government did that, and they rolled out quite a nice programme. And that's one of the things that killed off concern about 3G. But one of the reasons that this bubbles up again and again and again is that people take their eye off the ball and they forget to take it seriously, and they don't bother putting the effort into squashing it as it pops up, playing whack-a-mole, if you like, on the thing as it appears, and it comes up, it gets a critical mass, and it takes off again. And what you've got to do is be proactive and actually pile in and say, do you know what, we've got the science on this, and it's absolutely junk, and then try and kill it as it comes up. And I think the UK government particularly were too busy doing other things over the last 5 years to really perhaps keep this under control. And you're beginning to see a few strong statements coming out now from government, but it probably needs something a little bit stronger, some unequivocal stuff, just to say, do you know what, move on.
I suppose I've thought of a question now, which is, what's the sort of the strongest action you've seen from the other side? Are people tearing down 5G masts and?
Yeah, I mean, you guys have seen as much as I have. I've just seen the YouTube videos of people burning down 5G masts.
Or things they think are 5G masts, usually.
Yeah, it's what they think is 5G masts. Usually it isn't, because you can't tell. Yeah, it looks the same because the antennas look very similar. It's probably smaller. I mean, what you're seeing these days for 5G are basically the sort of street monopole stuff, the sort of thing, stuff that looks like lampposts. It's often a bit taller because they've allowed, under planning regs, you can have tall masts, so the newer stuff tends to be taller because it's convenient. But it's actually less intrusive, so you really can't tell what's up there. And unfortunately, you see the guys working on these sites, you see engineers being terrorised by people. But I've never, it's just a bunch of nutters doing that, really. I don't know what you do about that.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Phil. That
Right.
was really interesting. I certainly learned a lot, and we've had some good questions from the chat, and it's been really, really good. Thank you very much.
If you want to know more, if you look on my facts, which ianfields.com/facts, it's easy to find. All of this stuff and more is on the facts.
If I haven't already, I will stick that link in the. Description down below as soon as we've finished. So,
and the contact page is now working. It was some sort of hosting issue. I think you said to me.
Yes, I couldn't get that to work.
Yeah, it was embarrassing. It was something to do with the hosting. It wasn't me. It was whoever's hosting it turned off some aspect of PHP on the site, and the contact form wasn't working. So once you said that, I chased it, and it's now working again. So
cool.
Thanks for that. So we should be. If you want to know anything, just drop me.
So the crazies can now contact you if they want to.
Well, anybody can contact me, but you will notice that I don't put my email address or phone number directly on that website for obvious reasons.
No.
So you can contact me through the website, but I'm not going to tell you what my email address is.
Thanks again.
Okay.
Sam, so next time. Next time I'm going to be doing a talk on the techniques of science denial. So that'll be in a couple of weeks' time. And there's you
just see the googly eyes.
You've seen the googly eyes on the
today will come up,
yeah. We may also be doing
some of the things Phil mentioned, like cherry picking and.
Yes, exactly. Yes, cherry picking. Fake experts, logical fallacies, conspiracy theories. All of the good stuff will come up in that. And there's a possibility we may be doing something with Cambridge University. We're in talks with them at the moment, so watch this space for that. But thank you all for joining us. I hope you've had a good time as I have, and see you again in a couple of weeks' time.
Brilliant. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
It's good fun.
Thanks, Phil.
Right. Look how I get out of this now.